The year is 1995 and Doom has established itself as one of the pioneering games in the FPS genre. By this point we'd also seen the release of other titles like System Shock, Rise of the Triad and Heretic, all games which took the formula and ran with it. Then along comes a game like Descent. Still a first-person shooter in the sense of the perspective, but offering up 6 degrees of movement as you control a pilot inside a ship, exploring mines to destroy virus-infected robots and rescue hostages from their metallic clutches. In a truly 3D environment, Descent took the FPS genre to new heights and depths, pun intended. We'd never really had anything quite like this before, a game where you could truly move in any direction and change your orientation at the drop of a hat. And to top it all off, the game could run at a whopping 640 by 480 resolution. Holy shit. Developed by Parallax Software, it was originally released in 1995 and it's often hailed as a masterpiece, one of the best FPS games of all time and all that. Well, that's a bold statement. So let's jump in our Pyro GX, enter the world of motion sickness and see what all the fuss was about, shall we? What story there is in Descent is mostly delivered through the intro cinematic. You're briefed by a mysterious executive working for the PTMC, or the Post-Terran Mining Corporation. Given the task of going to a bunch of different mines across various planets to destroy the robots inside that have been infected by a virus and become hostile. Like most FPS games from the 90s, the whole thing was split up between a shareware episode and the full version. In the shareware version, you had to complete 7 levels set on the Moon, Venus and Mercury, with a boss fight to complete the Mercury mines. In the full version, a further 23 levels, including a couple of secret levels, took place on Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Pluto and Uranus. Uranus. The structure level to level was pretty much the same and standard for the time. You just explored the level, found the blue, red or yellow key and did your best to locate and rescue the hostages, before blowing up the reactor and hightailing it the hell out of there before the mine crumbled down around you. As you'd escape, there'd be this cool scripted sequence where the walls started to explode around you, like Lando flying the Millennium Falcon out of the Death Star before it blew up in Return of the Jedi. And watching this scripted sequence every time you completed a level never got old. Unlike games like Doom and Heretic though, the environments in Descent were a lot more complex due to the fact that you had such a greater range of movement, and it allowed for some really elaborate and confusing layouts. Unlike Doom and Heretic though, which often tried to make the levels feel like tangible places that had a sense of structure, the levels in Descent are more maze-like, hands down labyrinthian at times, as you'd expect to see in a game like Wolfenstein 3D. I mean, they're supposed to be mines and all that, which is fair enough, but that doesn't excuse the fact that you're probably going to get lost a fair bit. The map screen can help you figure out where you are and where you're supposed to go, but you really need to be patient and get your bearings, and it's obvious some of these levels have been designed to be as confusing and challenging as possible. Challenging being the key word here. You see, Descent comes from that golden age of gaming where video games didn't really give two shits about the player in the sense of whether or not they won or lost. Descent is hard, like really hard. It's like the game knows it's going to kill you over and over and it just doesn't care. The cold hard truth is that the game doesn't like you. But it's alright, I do. Now there's 5 difficulty levels on offer. You've got Trainee, Rookie, Hotshot, Ace and Insane. And initially you'd think that choosing a difficulty like Hotshot or Ace is a good place to start, and you'd probably think you've made the right decision until you get to the 6th or so level and end up getting killed every time you turn a corner. There's 2 main reasons for this, or at least I should say 2 main robots. Firstly, there's the Drillers, which are robots that are the only hit scanning enemies in the game and arguably one of the worst. Often the moment you see these guys is the same moment you lose 20 or 30 shield points. In case you don't know what hit scanning means, that's basically an enemy type that damages you when you're in its line of sight, at which point you're unable to avoid taking damage, like at all. Basically every enemy in every single Call of Duty game. Classic examples of these enemy types ruining games are the chain gunners in Doom 2 and the arachnoids in Serious Sam. Now look, it's not a game-breaking thing, but it does detract from the skill in shooting games a fair bit. You almost have to know where these types of enemies are beforehand to avoid taking damage from them. The other enemy type in Descent is the Hulk. It's a bigger robot that launches homing missiles which are painfully accurate. Like accurate to the point that they make the Mancubus rockets in Doom 2 look like a gorilla flinging its crap at someone. And to make it worse, you encounter these pricks all the time. Honestly, all of the other robots you come up against can be beaten easily as long as you're mobile, making sure you're always on the move to avoid their projectile lasers, but the Hulks and Drillers require a different approach. At a point where you'd think you can almost run and gun, or fly and gun through levels, when you start to encounter these enemies frequently, you really have to take your time and check a room before hurtling into it. Honestly though, Descent would be infinitely more enjoyable without them, and I think they're everything that's wrong with the game. Descent is interesting too in the way that it kind of harks back to an older age of gaming with a score system and limited lives. You've still got a health bar of sorts and can save at any time, but whenever your ship is destroyed, you simply lose a life and spawn back at the start of the level. At times it's even a smarter idea to let yourself be blown up if your energy is too low and you're unable to find power-ups. Once you find the spot you were killed, the items you had equipped can be picked up again without any real penalty. Controlling your ship is easy, fluid, and most of all, it's fun. You've got a forward and a backward control, you can bank left or right, turn left or right, and also slide left or right. You think that controlling everything with the mouse would be the easiest, but it's also pretty comfortable using the keyboard as well. It can take a bit of buggering around to find the controls that work for you and get settled in, but when you do, it's pretty damn seamless, and you can move in a hurry and get where you need to go without that much of a fuss. If you played any FPS game from the 90s, the other gameplay mechanics are going to be recognisable as well. Shield energy is basically your health points and can be restored from power-ups you find in each level, and your weapon energy is, well, for your weapons. You've got a basic laser which can be upgraded 4 times, the Vulcan cannon or minigun, you've got the quad laser, spread cannon, and a plasma cannon. Then there's a few types of missiles and proximity bombs that can be used as well. Yeah, I guess it's a fair bit to contend with, and some of the levels can be utter chaos, but in the best way possible. When you've got half a dozen robots attacking you and you're firing off homing missiles as you dart around them, firing back with your plasma cannon. It's awesome. The fact that the game is now over 20 years old and still a joy to control speaks volumes. Now look, Sonny Jim, Descent doesn't really have anything outright wrong with it, and I guess you really have to keep in mind the time the game was made when you talk about its potential flaws. One thing that's always been an issue for me personally is that the game has given me really bad motion sickness. I'm playing the game in a source port called D1X Rebirth, which makes the resolution a lot higher, which I think does help, but even then I can really only play for like 10 or 15 minutes before I just start getting a really bad headache. It joins that select few games that have forced me to take breaks, along with the original PC port for Turok 2. I do think Descent is a masterpiece from a certain perspective. I mean, it's definitely a product of its time, and I don't think it's aged quite as well as Doom has, but it is still a challenging shooting game and hands down one of the more noteworthy games of its era. The visuals look pretty unique when you compare them to other stylized games like Heretic and Quake, and it does have a really great soundtrack, synonymous with lots of PC games from around that same era. And like I said, the fact that the game still controls like a dream in this source port means I think a lot of people will still get a fair bit of fun out of it, as long as you can accept that you're going to get your ass kicked along the way. Eventually there was a port for the PlayStation 1 released, which got mixed reviews from critics, but more importantly, in 1996, the proper sequel, Descent 2, was unleashed as well. After having spent any time with the first game, Descent 2 should feel right at home, and in a lot of ways it's more like a glorified expansion pack than it is a full-blown sequel. Having said that, it's still got a few significant gameplay changes, but the way the game plays out for the most part is identical to the first game. I think the first thing you'll notice when loading Descent 2 up is that it now has fully animated cinematics as opposed to static images with text. In the opening cinematic, which is fully voice acted, the story kicks off after the ending to the first game, where your character is told by the PTMC that his work isn't yet finished. Turns out there's some kind of clause in your character's contract that says the PTMC has the right to keep him on hand for 72 hours after completion. If he doesn't abide to that, he'll be found in breach of his contract, losing his compensation and potentially facing legal action from the PTMC directly. All of this mostly just serves as a means to explain why you're still working for the PTMC than anything else, and after this surprisingly lengthy cinematic, you're back to doing what you do best, going from mine to mine, destroying more virus-infected robots. This time, however, you're not just in a single solar system, in fact you're actually going to a bunch of these with cool looking cinematics introducing each of them for the first time. Those end of level escape sequences are now also replaced with a cinematic, which changes depending on the system you're in. I mean, yeah, it looks kinda basic nowadays, but back in 1996 this was pretty revolutionary stuff, taking full advantage of the blisteringly fast CD-ROM speed, which you can also notice with the awesome new soundtrack. All of the levels play out as they did in the first game. You control your ship through 6 degrees of movement, searching for the red, blue, and yellow keys as you avoid or kill all the hostile robots. Once you've found all the keys, you head for the reactor before blowing it up and escaping before the whole place self-destructs. Each system you visit kind of has a theme to it in a sense, whether it be water, fire, or ice, and there's actually a half-decent variety between them, whereas a lot of the mines in the first game I thought looked very similar and got a little bit boring. Again, there's a bunch of primary and secondary weapons to utilize, from lasers and missiles, and you're also looking for secret areas and trying to rescue the hostages. Like I said, it's the same as the first game, but as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. One thing I did notice straight off the bat is that the robots seem a lot more aggressive and also intelligent, able to evade your attacks a lot easier and also punishing you if you stay in one spot for too long. But then there's the more abundant, numerous little gameplay changes, however, which is where Descent 2 really differentiates itself, and I'd say pretty much all of these changes changed the game for the better. For starters, they've almost completely gotten rid of the Driller and Hulk robots. The Drillers were those hit-scanning enemies I was talking about before that could take a huge chunk of your shield off in mere seconds if you got in their line of sight. The Hulks were the big red robots with homing missiles that you'd encounter frequently as well, and both of these enemies highlighted the weakest elements of Descent's combat. Now, there are robots in Descent 2 that are variants of both of these, but they're much more balanced and encountered less frequently, meaning that the difficulty in Descent 2 feels a lot more genuine and fair to the player. These are positive changes. Another huge change is the inclusion of the guide bot. Now, this thing is a little robot you'll often find near the beginning of a level that, when freed, is going to fly around guiding you straight to the keys you need before the reactor and even the level exit. Anyone who's played Descent will know how confusing the goddamn map screen can be at times, and even navigating the map screen to find out where you need to go can be a chore. Using the guide bot alleviates this problem entirely, and this little guy's going to show you exactly where you need to go. If you don't want to use him and find your way to the exit by yourself, well, then that's all fine and dandy, but it does seem Parallax Software kind of acknowledged that some people had difficulty navigating their way through certain levels. And adding this robot in is a goddamn godsend at times. He's even polite enough to come back and get you if the two of you get separated. I mean, what a nice little chap. Simply opening doors or force fields now often has to be done by finding and destroying the corresponding control panel, which often isn't too far away, but necessary to progress. Weapons have been updated slightly as well, so now your basic laser can be upgraded 6 times instead of 4. All of your primary weapons have more powerful updated variants as well, like the Spreadfire Cannon has the updated Helix Cannon, and the Vulcan Cannon has the badass Gauss Cannon, which is probably my favourite new weapon in the game. New missiles include the Flash Missile, Guided Missile, Mercury, and Earthshaker Missile. And now you've got a converter which can turn weapon energy into shield energy, and also an afterburner which drains your weapon energy but increases your speed for a short period of time. Again, not massive changes, but just simple enough that they really do have a pretty huge effect on the fundamentals of the gameplay, and I think it just makes it objectively better than the first game. I mean, after playing Descent 2 for so long, it just kind of feels weird to play the first game again and not be able to use the afterburner, or the Gauss Cannon for instance, and fighting the robots also feels like a bit of a step backwards. As you'd expect too, there's a lot of new robots to contend with, most of which are derivative of the robots from the first game, though there is a few new additions. Like the Thief Bot for instance, which kind of does what you'd expect, coming up and stealing your shit. And each 4 levels you have to take on a boss robot, which is just a larger robot that takes a hell of a pounding before going away, like my ex-girlfriend. Looking for things to complain about with Descent 2 is kinda hard, and a lot of the things that I take issue with are more subjective than anything else. Like Descent 1, Descent 2 still gives me motion sickness to an extent. I can only ever play a couple of levels before I have to take a break, but this isn't really an objective fault. I'm just a bit of a little bitch who was lucky enough to have a middle ear infection as a child that screwed up my equilibrium ever since. I'm also colorblind and white as a bedsheet, so yeah, thanks genetics. Also, controlling your ship can be confusing at first, even if you're half decent at FPS games, and I honestly think it's one of those things that players are either going to get or they're not. I mean, like, it's either going to click with you or you're never going to get the hang of it. There's a few really cheap areas in certain levels, normally those where you've got an enemy spawner that just constantly spawns in a never-ending barrage of robots. But I think you can count the amount of times this happens in the game on one hand, so it's not that much of a deal. One thing I think does suck though is how tricky it can be to actually get your hands on this game. In 2015 or 2016 I think it was, the game got pulled from Steam and goodoldgames.com for reasons surrounding licensing or copyright or whatever the hell it was with Parallax Software. There was a mission pack released in late 1996 which adds a bunch of new levels in as well, but copies of this seem to be rarer than photos of Jennifer Lawrence with her clothes on. I think your best bet if you want to pick this game up and give it a crack is to get it from Amazon or eBay. Though the dilemma here is that it's literally a limited commodity now at this point, and I guess once the physical copies have been sold, that's all there is. When I compare Descent 2 to the first game, I'd say Descent 2 is a lot more enjoyable on the whole. It feels like everything I disliked about the first game has been fixed or at the very least improved. The guide bot removes the tedium of spending 30 minutes on a level trying to find the next keycard, and the removal of the more unfair and irritating Driller and Hulk enemies makes the game's difficulty feel much more genuine and balanced, and it's actually more skill based now when you're playing on the higher difficulties. Don't get me wrong though, Sunny Jim, this is still a damn challenging game and a product of its time. As I said, it feels like a game made in the 90s through and through. And unless you have some kind of nostalgic attachment to this period of gaming, you might not find Descent 1 or Descent 2 as enjoyable as other people will. After the release of both of these games, Parallax Software split up and went their separate ways, with one group going on to make Descent 3 and the others forming Volition, developing the Red Faction games, another series of games ironically about mines. But Descent 1 and Descent 2 are these really raw, unadulterated examples of old school shooting that have really stood the test of time in terms of the challenge they offer up to the player. So I'd say if you can get a copy of them, then give it a go. Get them running in a source port, crank that awesome soundtrack up to 11, and start destroying robots. They're not for everybody, but if you can stomach the nauseating controls, the labyrinthian level design, and the constant onslaught of robots trying to blow you to smithereens, it truly doesn't get much better than this.